to all the directors for handling that well. It'll just be another moment while I just get that cleared up and ready for the next session. So as mentioned before, if you have questions throughout today, please use the Q&A feature. Just to clarify, my session today is going to be on some of the industry changes that have happened over the last year. 3 big ones, which will be email as a method of service, the ending tenancies for repairs and renovations change, and of course, the additional rent increase for capital expenditures. Before I get started, I just want to see if we have Amy Berea on the line. She is from First On Site, and she's just be saying a few words.
I am here, Hunter. Yes, thank you.
Fantastic, Amy. You can go ahead and you should be able to turn your camera on now.
Yes, let me attempt to do that. That works.
Fantastic. Welcome, Amy.
Perfect. Thank you very much. My name's Amy Barilla. I'm here from First On Site Restorations, and I am the Business Development Manager for BC, for the province of BC. So we are a national company, so North American property restoration company. We specialize in emergency mitigation and then the subsequent repairs of any property damage. So, the majority of property damage losses that we would see would be water damage. So any type of pipe burst or mechanical, fire, vehicle impact to building is a common one that will be called out to, as well as mold or asbestos, testing, remediation, consulting on that. Catastrophic, any kind of catastrophe. So any type of government deemed catastrophe, sometimes that's flood, earthquake, fire, etc. And also biohazard cleanup, which can be an unfortunate part of, being a landlord is having a biohazard situation in your home that you own. So a tenant passes away, or there's some type of cleanup that involves any type of biohazardous materials. And we do COVID cleaning or disinfection as well. So that kind of sums up, I want to say, our core offerings that we would be involved in or be called out for, specifically for rental properties. We work with all major insurance companies, so we're on the list of approved vendors for most major national insurers. We've got great relationships with brokers, and we are well known in the insurance industry. So you can always just rest assured that if a loss or an event triggers an insurance policy, that we will still be supported on that end. So I think that kind of here locally, I just want to say we've got 3 branches in the Lower Mainland. So Abbotsford, Surrey, and Vancouver, and those branches serve everywhere, probably from Hope to Whistler. And we've got 22 project managers that are available, and I think our number will be on here, and maybe I can circulate that if anybody needs any follow-up information. It's a 24/7 emergency line that you can call. And that's it. Hunter, thank you for offering to play the video for me.
No problem. No problem. We are ready to go. Let me just make sure that that is.
We are Reach Amplified, serving across the US, Canada, Puerto Rico, and beyond. We are Preparedness Elevated, aligning with our clients' priorities before an event occurs. Experience unrivaled. with extensive property restoration knowledge across all types of industries. We are human power multiplied, with over 2,000 team members ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. Excellence, unmatched, bringing industry-leading safety protocols to every single project. We are purpose fulfilled, helping our clients restore, rebuild, and rise. We are North America's trusted leader in property restoration, the only partner you'll ever need, no matter what. First on site. Together we rise.
Thank you, Amy, for your message and for sponsoring today's event. And thank you for sending us that video so we could share that. Our first time sharing video on one of our events. So again, thank you very much.
No problem, and thank you for allowing me to join and just say a few words. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And it'll just be one moment here while we just get I get the next part of our event today underway, which is just our presentation here on some of the changes in our industry. Okay. Fantastic. So it should now be. Okay. So as mentioned, we are going to be going over 3 industry changes that have occurred over the last year. And I mean, we could probably spend a couple hours going through all the changes specifically over the last 18 months, which have as tired as the phrase may be, unprecedented times. They certainly have been that. But with that being said, there have also been many changes that have occurred over the last year that are not about COVID-19. Things that have been in the works for quite some time by LandlordBC and our advocacy efforts, as mentioned by Jason Middleton in the AGM portion. So, like I said, we're going to go over some of these changes. Before I get into each one of them, just a little bit of background as to where these changes came from. All 3 of these changes are part of the rental task force, the rental housing task force, which was struck by the government several years ago now, and it really it seems almost forever ago that this happened and that we participated in that. But what came out of that task force was a list of recommendations to help modernize and improve the rental housing industry. Many of these changes were systemic changes to the way the residential tenancy branch operates or conducts processes, things such as the rent increase, which of course we know there was a change to that several years ago. When the change to the rent increase came up, removing the 2%, there was also a promise to, and a recommendation to address rent increases for the purposes of capital expenditures. So after several years, that came to fruition. The next part to this, to the rental housing task force in their list of recommendations was, of course, about ending tenancy for repairs or renovations. It's a topic that we've seen in the media quite a bit, and unfortunately has been misused in the past. As such, new processes were developed, and as that was during that development process, we consulted with the government, or were consulted with the government, on how to make this process work best. Another item that was covered in the Rent Housing Task Force was being able to send documents via email, a method of service that previously had not been included as a legal method of service for, well, at all. Certainly something that had been widely used by both landlords and tenants in this industry for years, but hadn't been recognized by the Residential Tenancy Act as a valid method of service. So, like I said, those are the three things that we're going to be going over. If you do have questions, I will get to them at the end of the session. And it looks like looks like someone cannot see the slide. I just want to make sure that everyone can see the slide. So I think I've changed something. So hopefully that will fix that. Thank you. Magic of technology. We're all here connected, but there's always going to be something. So ending tenancies for repairs or renovations. This is not something that has been taken away or anything like that. It's just the process has changed. The primary difference between the previous method of ending tenancy for repairs or renovations and the current method is that instead of serving a notice to end tenancy, which previously would have been the 4-month notice to end tenancy, and to be clear, that notice does still exist for the other reasons that are listed on that, such as converting the unit to non-residential use, and a few other items. It still exists for those reasons, but now instead of serving the document, you as a landlord would apply through the dispute resolution process in advance. And from there, an arbitrator will review whether or not the work that is being done meets their criteria, which we'll go into in a bit of detail. So this is the section of the Act, and today we're not going to be going through a lot of the Act, but I think it's important to look at what the Act says. Because the one thing about the Residential Tenancy Act, as opposed to some other pieces of legislation, is that it is written in a way that is meant to be understood as much as possible. And clearly there are sometimes situations where there is some ambiguity in places where it's simply not clear. But in this case, we can look at this and at this section of the Act and get a good idea of what this means in terms of how it applies. So the first part, and this is actually really one of the most important parts, is that the landlord intends in good faith to renovate or repair the unit and has all the necessary permits and approvals required by law to carry out the renovations. The key words here are in good faith. This is really important. And one of the problems that has occurred in the past is that sometimes the notice was given where there wasn't good faith. For whatever the reason was, the landlord in that situation chose to end the tenancy using this notice, choosing that option, but didn't in fact intend in good faith to renovate. We know that wasn't the majority of people by any means, and it wasn't. And likely no one here on our webinar today or on the event today, but it was used, unfortunately, by just enough bad actors that it caused that issue. The next part here is that the renovations or repairs require the rent unit to be vacant. So this clearly is a statement that is open to interpretation. But if we want to look at it in its simplest terms, is that we look at the word require. It needs to be vacant to conduct these repairs or renovations. And when we look at what that means in terms of needs, well, if we say are going to be replacing countertops in a kitchen, Well, the unit doesn't need to be vacant during that. I'm sure anyone who's remodeled their kitchen knows that you can generally live in the space while that type of work is being done. Same with painting walls. Certainly it's a hassle when the unit is being lived in, but painting walls can be done when someone is living there. It's generally only a couple of days of inconvenience. Same with, replacing faucets, or fixtures in bathrooms. Those again are things that might cause an inconvenience, maybe even for a couple of days, maybe even loss of use for a couple of days, but don't require the unit to actually be vacant. Don't require a tenancy to be ended. We then look at the next option, C, is that the renovations or repairs are necessary to prolong or sustain the use of the rental unit or the building in which the rental unit is located. So when we look at that one, that is very clear that the work needs to be required, essentially. It doesn't use that word here, but we're gonna kind of put that in where necessary is. It is required to ensure the property itself can be used in the future. And of course, that's really important in British Columbia, where we do have an aging rental stock. And with that aging rental stock requires a significant amount of work. And there's a variety of ways to get that work completed in buildings, but every now and again, there are situations where the unit may need to be vacant to conduct that work. And again, the only reasonable way to achieve the necessary vacancy is to end the tenancy. So if, for example, you need the unit to be vacant for a short period of time, a week or so, that's probably not long enough. Well, it isn't going to be long enough to really warrant an end of tenancy. There's likely other accommodations that can be met in those types of situations. Now, if this is going to be a several months, 6 months, a year-long project, which some projects certainly can be, especially in older buildings, and especially in older buildings where perhaps there is asbestos or a high level of asbestos, where the work being done is going to cause an issue with that, and it's perhaps a very large project. In those cases, those types of situations likely would meet the criteria. Again, we're just going to go over just a couple of definitions here, and we're using the definitions as found in the policy guideline on this topic. So again, to prolong and sustain, this is to qualify for this from a tenancy. A landlord must show that the work is necessary to prolong and sustain. This includes things like seismic upgrades, replacing a sprinkler system to meet code, updating electric wiring to code. And again, those are specific examples of things that would prolong or sustain the building. They do also have to meet the other criteria, which is that it is necessary and that it is the only reasonable method. So again, an example is that it is going to be unsafe for residents, or a prolonged loss of a service or facility. And an example of that is, it's not like they don't have access to the pool for 6 months or a year. That's certainly an inconvenience, but not reasonable to end the tenancy over that. But if the work is going to make something as essential as electricity or water unavailable in the building for a prolonged period of time, that would show that clearly there's no other reasonable accommodation that can be met. So again, it's about meeting all of the criteria as listed in the Residential Tenancy Act. And just a reminder, please go ahead and send your questions in as they come in, and we will get to those at the end of my session. Okay, so we're going to now talk briefly about serving documents via email, which is more than a decade in the making. When I started in this industry at LandlordBC, now over 13 years ago, I would say, shocked to learn that email was not a method of service. And of course, that was back, that was a while ago, 2008. And at that time, we could use fax as a method of service, but we could not use email. The government acknowledged at that time that was a problem, and they committed to ensure that is something that would be used, that could be used as a method of service in the future. And they were just working out to see how that would look. A lot has happened between then and now, and the government has made many changes. Focuses have shifted, but I'm very happy to say that now, officially, as of earlier this year, email can be used as a method of service. This is important because, of course, especially as we learned during the pandemic, email is really a vital service that people use. It is something that clearly we need to ensure is accessible to both landlords and tenants. When you don't necessarily always want to go and see someone in person, not because you don't necessarily like them, but simply because it is a more efficient and, these days, safer way of serving documentation. And also, truthfully, most people prefer it. I know that most tenants have no problem and prefer being able to receive something via email. One of the upsides, again, to email is that it's a little bit harder to lose things unless you accidentally delete the email. So there's some significant benefits to this. Now, while email is a method of service, it should be noted that there's a few things that need to be considered when serving documents via email. And the first thing that needs to really be considered is that both parties need to provide an email address to the other party and indicate that it is meant to be used as a method of service. So if you've received an email address from someone who has applied to live in your rental unit, that's good, you have their email address, but they haven't necessarily indicated that they intend to allow you to use that method as a method of service. So again, there needs to be something really clear. And the way we document that is actually, there is an RTB form and it is on the LandlordBC tenancy agreement. So again, just make sure you have that documented either on our agreement or using that RTB form. Okay, so we're going to spend the remainder of this session talking about the additional rent increase process for capital expenditures. So this process came into being, existence earlier this year in July. It is the result of a significant amount of work done by the residential tenancy branch, their policy team, in collaboration with LandlordBC. The process itself is new, and with this new process, we are learning how it can be applied to our industry and applied to our businesses. As Jason kind of mentioned in the beginning of the process, or beginning of the AGM, this new process essentially allows landlords to recoup the costs that you incur when conducting a capital expenditure. And we're going to go through kind of some of the details of what those capital expenditures are. Before we get into that, we just want to really quickly kind of go over the basics of rent increases so it's understood, because the basics of rent increases also apply to this as well. So of course, it's important to note that during a tenancy, you as a landlord may only increase rent once every 12 months. Of course, we know that over the last 18 months, there has been a rent increase freeze. That is, clearly in response directly to the COVID-19 pandemic, not normal by any means, and that has been lifted. So rents can increase as of January 1st, which means people who serve their rent increases in September will see a rent increase in January. And again, if you serve it in October, then it's February. It's always 3 clear calendar months. So when it comes to the rent increase formula, that is set. It is based on the BC's all item CPI, an average of the last 12 months from July compared to the previous 12 months. So that's a regular rent increase formula. There are options to increase it in addition as higher than the amount that is set out in the regulations. And in those cases, generally speaking, and what we're going to be talking about today is making an application. Now, the idea of making an application itself for an additional rent increase is not necessarily new, but the reason for it and the process and the formula is something that is quite a bit more defined with this new process. So when it comes to applying, the additional rent increases are essentially granted or issued by an arbitrator through the residential tenancy branch's dispute resolution process. It is done just like any other dispute resolution process. There's a conference call that is convened, and at a conference call, at one of these dispute resolution hearings, there is the opportunity of both landlords and tenants to speak and present evidence. Obviously, it's very important from a landlord standpoint that they do in fact submit evidence. That's the whole point of this process. And the majority of this process will be focusing on that evidence. So when it comes to capital expenditures, you can apply for this additional rent increase. Before you even get to the point of making an application, though, you need to make sure that you fully understand the eligibility requirements. And to be clear, while there is, this process is meant to be used, it's meant to be very positive for our industry, there is a lot that goes into it. So you need to make sure that you have done your homework essentially to ensure that when you get to the actual application process and you get to the hearing, that you're meeting those eligibility criteria. So you're not wasting your time and your money, because there is a cost to apply, which we'll get to in a moment. And then you're not, taking up time at the residential tenancy branch. As we know, there is a backlog there. So certainly that's something that needs to be considered. So the first thing is looking at timing. The first part here is that any expenditure that you're looking at applying for must be expected to not recur for at least 5 years, and needs to have been incurred. The cost needs to have been incurred within the 18-month leading up to the date the application is made. And we'll get into a bit more detail as to what that specifically means, that 18-month period and incurred. But we'll start here just with that 5 years. So before even starting, you need to make sure that the work that is being done happened in the last 8 months, the cost that was incurred in the last 8 months, and that you're not going to have to do this again in the next 5 years. So replacing a roof, for example, generally roofs, and they should last longer than 5 years. So it's expected that they would not reoccur in the next 5 years when you have a roof replaced. So that would meet that very basic eligibility criteria on the surface. We'll go into the further criteria to make sure it continues to meet the criteria. But on the surface, based on the fact that roofs generally are expected to last longer and not be replaced in as frequently as 3 or 4 years, then it would meet that criteria. things, again, where they are expected to reoccur, where you do need to replace it every few years, are generally not considered part of your capital expenditures for the purposes of this increase. So if we look at the criteria, what is the work that can be done? Well, when we look at this work, it's either to install, repair, or replace a major component or major system for the purposes of maintaining the property in a state of repair that complies with the Residential Tenancy Act, or that is a major component or system that has failed or is malfunctioning or inoperative, or is close to the end of its useful life. So we go back to the example of a roof, for example. Clearly, the replacement of a roof is generally always going to be made for the purposes of maintaining the property in a state that complies with the Residential Tenancy Act, and there's some things there that we can go into more detail of. But if it's close to its end of its useful life as well, or it is no longer functioning properly, then it would clearly meet that criteria. And clearly a roof is a major component of a building. Additionally, capital expenditures may be considered if it reduces energy use or greenhouse gas emissions, or improves the security of the residential property. So again, those two, while improving the security of the residential property may not necessarily be considered a major component or major system, it would still be considered under this. So we're going to go into a bit more detail of what these words mean. So when we talk about major component, a component of residential property that is integral to the residential property, or a significant component of a major system. That is the definition that they have for this term. So let's go into a major system. Well, a major system would be things like an electrical system, a mechanical system, structure, or similar type system. It's something that is so important that it's considered integral to the residential property, whether that's to provide services to the tenants or occupants, or just, again, make sure that the property is in fact habitable. When it comes to services, that includes things like appliances, utilities, elevators, intercom systems. Those are all considered services. We need to make sure, again, that what we're talking about is always that it is a major service or a major system. Some facilities to consider are things like parking, laundry, storage, common recreational facilities that are considered part of the residential property. Those are all facilities that may be considered. Now, a term that you'll see when going through this process is the physical integrity. Generally, to be considered a major system or component, it must be essential to support or enclose a building, protects integrity, or support the critical function of the residential property. So it's something that, again, we're looking at roofs, foundation obviously would be one, though generally you're not going to do that with tenants in the property. Water, electrical systems, those are some very clear examples. When it comes to greenhouse gas reduction, if the capital expenditure does not meet those other criteria, so it's not to replace or repair a major system or component that is, old or failing, at the end of its life, but it is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example, such as replacing electric wastewater heating with a heat pump, installing solar panels, replacing single pane windows or with double pane windows. Those are the types of things that would generally meet that criteria. They may also meet other parts of the criteria as well, but certainly they do meet the criteria for reducing greenhouse gas. When it comes to security, the last criteria that we'll go over here is if it's meant to make that it better protects residents of the property, those expenditures may also be considered. Things like security fences and such, new intercom systems, those are the types of things that often increase security. We don't think we'll see too many of those increases in the cost for those are not always as high as other projects, but certainly can be considered. Some examples of these things that could be considered eligible would be things like the foundation, columns, walls, beams, the plumbing and sanitary systems, electrical wiring and elevators. Again, basically just all of the things that are really kind of primary to the tenancy, very much necessary. One point that it does make is that to meet the criteria, one of the options is that it must be to comply with the Residential Tenancy Act. One thing that the Residential Tenancy Act states is that when providing housing, you must provide and maintain the residential property in a state of decoration and repair that complies with the health, safety, and housing standards required by law. So while the Residential Tenancy Act does not specifically go into detail about how often things should be replaced or repaired, other pieces of law do. There is the building code, for example, electrical code, fire code. And in addition to that, there's municipal bylaws that need to be considered. So if the work that is being done for the purposes of meeting one of those other statutes, then it would likely fall under this eligibility criteria, so long as it is still, again, for the purposes of repairing or replacing that major system or major component. I also want to just take a quick look at the difference between end of life versus inoperative. Both certainly can be considered, but they are different. So it's important to ensure that they are treated differently in your application and in how you prepare for this. Installations, repairs, or replacements of the major systems or components may be considered if they're near the end of life or if they're inoperative or malfunctioning. Now, ideally, you're not waiting for things to break to replace them. In fact, that's one of the big pushes and thrusts of this new process, is that you don't wait for things to break. That most responsible landlords are in fact going to go through the work as it becomes necessary. And necessary really is once it's at its end of life. If you're replacing things that are inoperative, certainly it's necessary, but it might in some cases almost be too late, and it's going to cause a significant problem. So to get more information about the average life of major systems and components or building elements, Policy Guideline 40 does provide some details on that. But further than that, you should also have documentation based on when the system was initially installed or last maintained. So when you have that sort of information available, you should be able to determine when it's nearing its end of life and plan accordingly. This process is not intended in any way to cover minor repairs, and especially things that are considered cosmetic. So things like just painting the walls, patching drywall, repairing a single minor issue would not be considered eligible. And with that being said, certainly when you go through the work to conduct capital expenditures, oftentimes, even if the work is not intended to be cosmetic, there may be a cosmetic aspect of the project. And when we look at that, those costs may, the general upgrade itself may be considered eligible. So long as it still meets those other criteria, it could still be considered eligible. An example is replacing windows. Certainly if you have older single pane windows and replacing them with new, nicer looking windows, that's meaning likely some reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or energy use. That likely is to occur, and you should be able to get documentation of that as the new windows should be more efficient. But there's also a cosmetic aspect to that. The fact that it's cosmetic in that case, as well as meeting other criteria, doesn't mean that it would be thrown out. So it's just that if it is purely for the purposes of being cosmetic, that you would have a problem. And again, just to go back, things that are expected to be incurred again in 5 years are generally not considered. Additionally, things that are routine maintenance are not things that generally would be considered. So that's things like replacing HVAC filters, carpet cleaning. Those are things that, I mean, first you may do on a more regular basis, perhaps, less than, hopefully, especially with carpet cleaning, less than waiting 5 years. But in any case, again, it's those regular maintenance things are generally things that need to be factored into just the average rent in general, and part of just conducting business. Now, if the work that needs to be done is caused by inadequate maintenance, so there's significant water damage done to a property, and that is because there has been a leak in the roof for the last 3 years, and the landlord was aware of it but chose to not get that repaired. The work that needs to be done to remediate the property, to repair the water damage, would likely not be considered eligible because there was a known issue that caused it, and there was a path to resolve that, to fix the roof, and that wasn't done. So in cases like that, you may end up not meeting that basic eligibility requirement because it is in fact considered to be caused by inadequate maintenance. So we're going to move on to another ineligibility standard, which is double payment. If you as a landlord collect payment for a capital expenditure through things like grants, rebates, or subsidies, or an insurance claim or settlement, the amount that is collected becomes ineligible. So, for example, we're just using fake numbers for this purpose. If you're making an application for $50,000, that is the amount that you spent to conduct these capital expenditures. And we know that they meet the criteria otherwise, but you're going to get $20,000 from an insurance settlement or an insurance claim. The amount that you can actually claim for, the amount that is eligible, would only be the remainder amount. So that's at $30,000. So any amount where you're already collecting payment on through another method would not be considered. Additionally, the work that is conducted by a landlord, so if you as a landlord went in to conduct the repairs or renovations, cannot be claimed, but the materials that are used could be claimed. So the time from a landlord, the labor completed by a landlord cannot specifically be claimed. So again, before we apply, we're going to go back to this, and you need to make sure that you do in fact do the work that is needed to determine eligibility. This is to ensure that what you are doing is to install, repair, or replace a major component or major system, to maintain the property in a state of repair that complies with the Residential Tenancy Act, or that has failed, or is malfunctioning or inoperative, or that is close to the end of its useful life. Went over those in detail. Again, if it doesn't meet those other criteria, but it reduces energy use or greenhouse gas emissions or improves the security of the residential property, it may be considered. So we're going to go, now that we've talked about eligibility, which is a big topic, And really, we have an hour today to talk about this. We could probably spend a couple hours just going over examples and that eligibility criteria and really breaking it down. So I do recommend that that before you get to the process of making the application, that you really go through that information. Before you apply, you should really be sure that you determine whether it's worth the time and effort, and really paying the application fee. There is an arbitrator, or is a calculator that may be used to determine the potential increase. So that's something to really ensure that you are starting with. That formula, the total ARI, the amount of rent increase that you will be given if your application is considered successful, is the eligible capital expenditures divided by the number of specified dwelling units divided by 120. So again, say we're looking at $50,000 that you're applying for. You divide that by the number of specified dwelling units in the building. We're going to get into what that means in just a moment. And then you divide that or amortize that for 10 years, which is 120 months, which is where that 120 comes from. Now, you don't need to write down this formula. You don't need to do the math yourself. Again, the residential tenancy branch has a calculator that allows you to determine what your potential increase should be. It's important to note that it is only a potential increase, because once you actually get to dispute resolution, when you go through the process, an arbitrator will review the expenditures that you've applied for and determine on a case-by-case basis for each expenditure as to whether or not it is considered eligible, or if all of it is considered eligible. And that's where they will, of course, then go back, take their amount that they've come up with and use this formula. So when we talk about dwelling units, we go back to that formula that says specified dwelling units, which is kind of a new term in the Residential Tenancy Act and the regulations. Dwelling units are considered livable units in a building on a residential property in which the capital expenditure was carried out. Now, this applies whether or not the unit is considered to be occupied under a residential tenancy. And as such, so this would also mean if you have a unit that is owner occupied, for example, or perhaps you have a couple units in your building that are not covered by the Residential Tenancy Act, but used for vacation rentals. Those still get considered when we talk about the number of units that are in the building. Obviously, we know we can't apply the rent increase to those, but they get calculated for the purposes of determining how many units are in the building. And again, the 120, as they say, it is generally considered a common practice to amortize these types of expenditures over several years for accounting purposes, for tax purposes. And for the purposes of this process, it's determined that these should be amortized over 10 years, which is 120 months. So again, that's where that 120 comes from. Now, we know, of course, in the residential tenancy branch knows that oftentimes landlords are not conducting one project at a time. In fact, it's very common for multiple projects to be on the go at the same time. In fact, oftentimes just simply makes sense to do more than one thing. It might be more cost effective to do a few projects at the same time. So this process allows you under one application to apply for any capital expenditures that have been incurred in the 18 months leading up to the date of making the application. Now, when we talk about the word incurred and the cost being incurred or the expenditure being incurred, it's considered to be incurred when the invoice is paid. Now, that's further defined, and we do need to further define that, because obviously in large scale projects, oftentimes those invoices are the invoice for, or the cost, the expenditure is not incurred all in one invoice. It may be incurred over several invoices over the course of the project. So it is considered incurred from the date the last invoice is paid. So if the project takes a year to complete and you pay, an invoice near the beginning and during the middle and at the end, or several throughout, we use that last invoice date as the 18-month countdown clock. Additionally, landlords may only make one application per building or property in an 18-month period unless the previous application was dismissed. So if you make an application this year and it's approved, you can't make another one for at least 18 months, which is important to know, because if you say have just completed a project and you know that in the next few months you're going to take on another project and it is going to be completed rather soon, or within that 18-month period, and you know that still this other project that you've just completed will still be eligible, it may make sense to wait at that point. So how do you apply? Well, just like anything, there is a form. With the residential tenancy branch, there's always going to be a form. In this case, the form is found on the residential tenancy branch's intake system, so their dispute resolution intake system. So when you go to the residential tenancy branch website, you'll see an option to apply for dispute resolution online. It requires a BC EID. For most landlords, that's just going to be a basic BC EID. For businesses, it will be a business BC EID. And when you make that application, essentially, again, it's made directly online through that system. While we say there is a form, the form is found through that system. You're not going to find a paper form for that. It is an online form through the RTB's intake system for dispute resolution. So in making the application, there is a fee. It is $300 plus $10 for each affected units. And all the affected units must be included in a single application. And this is to a maximum of $600. So if you're applying for 10 units, it's going to be your $300 plus $10 per unit. So $100 there. So that would be $400. And again, that's to a maximum of $600. Now, landlords are responsible for gathering and submitting the evidence to both support the amount of the expenditure and that the expenditures meet the eligibility requirement. So it is your responsibility as a landlord to gather that evidence. And I recommend, in fact, it really should be done, that you gather this evidence before you even make the application. The process, again, it's meant to be as transparent and clear as possible for both landlords and tenants. And part of that is making sure that the evidence is clear. So you don't want to scramble with evidence after the fact. So really you should be gathering that before. And now that we know that this process exists, really, when conducting any repair or renovation where you think you may consider submitting it for this process, that's when you gather that evidence as you're going through. So when things come in, when invoices come in, when reports come in about the work, when you do inspections, when other parties conduct inspections, in those cases, again, you're going to want to get that documentation and put that in the file for this type of application so you have it ready to go. So landlords need to consider including things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but does cover the majority of the basics. It is obviously going to be different on a case-by-case basis. And you may consider, seeking additional help in terms of putting together your evidence package, but this is just the basics of what you'd want to consider as evidence. So things such as photographs or video taken before and after the repair, which is, that's a fairly simple and straightforward piece of evidence, but oftentimes gets mislooked, especially taking photos at the beginning. Quite often people forget to take photos at the beginning of a process before the work has actually been conducted. But it's a good idea to take photographs really before, during, and after the project, so you can really prove the work was done and the process that was taken. Any copies of permits that are obtained, copies of any relevant laws or bylaws or construction standards that you are meeting or that the work is being done to meet, any expert reports regarding things such as, say, the useful life of the old system or component, and the expected lifespan of the installed, repaired, or replaced system. And especially when we look at systems such as heating systems, oftentimes they have that type of documentation with them. Additionally, the reason the installation, repair, or replacement was needed. So if you have someone who's conducted an inspection of a specific building component and said, well, this needs to be replaced in the next 2 years, well, that would show that it's likely meeting the end of its useful life. So it would meet the reason that the installation, repair, replacement was in fact needed. Maintenance records for the system being repaired or replaced is also really important to have, especially when showing that clearly it's not being caused due to negligence. Document showing the date the prior system or component was purchased and installed. So again, when talking about something's useful life, for example, we really can't talk about that unless we know when it was installed. And then any manufacturer's documents relating to the prior system's or components' useful life expectancy. That can sometimes be hard to find, because sometimes those are the types of documents that often do go missing. But it's really important that you do try to retain that documentation. And if you don't have that documentation, going back to the manufacturer to see if they have that documentation, and oftentimes they do. When it comes to evidence regarding greenhouse gases, specifically the reduction of greenhouse gases or energy use, this could be things such as utility bills, showing a difference in energy use before and after the installation, repair, replacement, manufacturer's documents showing the efficiency ratings of the new system or major component, and any expert reports that you may have. So if while conducting the work, you have hired a consultant to help with the process, generally part of that will be getting some type of report as to the efficiency of the system that's currently in place, along with what you'll be upgrading to, what the efficiency ratings will be for the new component. And of course, there also needs to be proof that the expenditure was in fact incurred. So that is something that is really, really important. Obviously, things such as receipts make sense. I mean, obviously, when wanting to conduct these types of repairs or these types of projects, you're going to have receipts, and an arbitrator is very much going to want to see these types of receipts. When it comes to the evidence, if there is any found to be any fraudulent or misleading information that is presented, so in the situation, like, I don't think this is something that anyone in this session needs to worry about themselves, but certainly it's important to know that it does exist. If, for example, someone were to make an application saying they've completed specific work, but in fact didn't complete that work, that would be considered to be fraudulent, likely, or misleading. And in that case, obviously the increase would not be awarded, but additionally, the Residence or Tenancy Bench may award a monetary administrative penalty. So there is not just the fact that the application will be declined, but that there is in fact a penalty for that. So once you have made an application, you will need to inform your tenants that you have made this application. That needs to go out within 3 days of you receiving it. So you'll make an application. you'll get in response a notice of proceedings, similar to the other dispute resolution proceedings at the residence or tenancy branch, and you must inform all of the tenants of that application. Additionally, landlords will need to provide robust evidence. We've kind of gone over what that is, but that evidence needs to go to both the residence or tenancy branch and all the affected tenants. Tenants who choose to do so may also submit their own evidence. And really a lot of the evidence that they're going to be submitting or that be considered would be around things such as grant or rebate applications that they know that you've made and perhaps received. It's very unlikely in most cases that tenants are going to have much in the way of evidence that would be considered in these processes, but they have the opportunity, which is important because the process is meant to be transparent and fair. So there is the option of both parties to be part of the process. So the hearing itself will be convened via teleconference, so it's over the phone, just like other dispute resolution hearings. And really, when you get to that hearing, as a landlord, you need to be prepared to review the evidence that you have submitted, rebut any claims or evidence that are opposed by the tenant or presented by the tenant, and of course, answer any questions that the arbitrator may have. Again, both landlords and tenants will have the opportunity to speak in this process. So when it comes to the decision itself, the arbitrator will review all evidence and consider any testimony presented at the hearing to render a decision. The arbitrator, essentially, really what they're there to do is to determine whether or not the expenses that you have submitted, the expenditures, in fact, meet the eligibility criteria. And in the process of that, if you've applied for multiple expenditures, they may allow part of the expenditures or some of the expenditures to be approved, and they may not allow others. Once they have that amount, the dollar figure that they feel you are entitled to, they will then apply that amount to the formula we talked about, which is taking that amount divided by the number of specified dwelling units, and then of course amortizing that over 10 years or 120 months. There is a cap to the increase. If you were to make an application and the application comes out with an increase that is higher than 3% of the individual tenant's rent, then that is the highest amount is that 3%. That being said, the amount that is higher than that 3%, so the remainder can then be applied in the subsequent years, and that's up to 3 years. So we'll take a quick look at what that may look like in a sample situation. So we have $100 and the rent increase is $1,000. So 3% of $1,000 is $30. So we increase the rent by $30. The new rent is now $1,030. We still have $70 of this increase remaining. So we can again increase it up to 30%. That gives us, because it's now based on the new amount, $1,030, the amount is increased a little bit. It's $30.90, not by much, but a little bit. That leaves $39.10 remaining. Our new rent is now $1,060.90. We can again apply up to 3%, which is $31.87 in this case, which brings the rent to $1,092. In this scenario, we have not factored in any other type of increase, which they do need to be factored in. So it does have a small amount left over, which simply cannot be applied in that case. That amount is lost in that situation. But as we can see, the vast majority of it is in fact applied to the rent. It is compound, and as mentioned, it can also include the other increases that may happen in a year, such as the standard rent increase. And we're going to get into how that works in our last slide here. So the increase still needs to be served via a rent increase process. It's still 3 months notice. that needs to be given. And you can utilize both this increase and the regular annual rent increase. And in that situation, you would put them both on the same form. In fact, there's even a new form for it because, of course, there's a new form for it. There's always a form at the residential tenancy branch. So that being said, this form is great because it does clearly show the increases that are being applied. One, based on the additional rent increase that is being provided by the residential tenancy branch. And second, the standard rent increase, which is provided by the residential tenancy branch. So in those situations, say you were increasing it by 3% and the rent increase was 1.5%, you'd be increasing the rent really by 4.5% that year. And that would then give us a new base rate to base next year's increases on. And again, it is compound in that aspect. So I'm going to just open it up to any questions. I know that many have come in. So I thank you very much for those questions. Let's go through those. So the first question that I see that has come in here is, can you use email as method of service for rent increases? Great question and on topic to what we've just been talking about. And the answer to that is yes. You are able, in fact, to use email as a method of service for rent increases. The reality is you can use email as a method of service for any document that is required to be served under the Residential Tenancy Act. So that is going to include things such as the rent increase, notice of entry, for example, caution notices, notices to end tenancy. When we talk about notices to end tenancy, I do generally recommend that you serve those in a way that can really be proven that it has been served. And with email, there are some problems with that clearly. I mean, you can send an email. Did they really receive it? Did they read it? We don't want to leave anything to chance with things as significant as ending tenancy. Additionally, with ending tenancy, oftentimes those situations end up at dispute resolution. And again, we don't want those anything to jeopardize that already somewhat delicate process. So while email may be used as a method of service to, say, serve a notice to end tenancy, you may, in situations, choose to use a different method, such as serving it directly to the tenant in person with a witness, and then filling out the proof of service form. In that situation, the tenant would have very little to argue that they didn't receive the notice, and there would be less of a chance of something happening or the notice being thrown out. So again, it's really important that you consider the specific document that you're serving when using email. Obviously, there are situations where there is no other option, and you simply do need to serve it via email. Thank you for that question. So another question around the change to the new 4-month notice. Obviously, we've talked about how there is a new process to end tenancy for repairs or renovations, whereby a landlord can apply to have their situation considered by an arbitrator as to whether or not they meet the criteria to end the tenancy for repairs or renovations. So that reason was essentially removed from the 4-month notice to end tenancy. But the 4-month notice to end tenancy does still exist. And one of the reasons to end tenancy on there is to demolish a rental unit. So if you are going through the work to demolish a rental unit, so the building needs to be demolished or is being demolished, and you have the necessary permits and approvals to do so, you would still simply just serve the 4-month notice. It wouldn't go through this new process because there's much less that needs to be determined in that situation. Clearly, the units would need to be vacated in a situation where the building is being demolished. Question about the capital expenditures that has come in is, will a roof replacement on an apartment building be considered a valid capital expenditure? And the answer to that is generally yes. Roof replacements are generally going to be considered valid capital expenditures. We go back to the eligibility criteria. So is it meant to repair or replace? Which clearly it's meant to replace, it's right in the question. Is it a major component or major system? And the answer to that is, yeah, a roof is clearly going to be considered a major component of the building. Without a roof, you can't really live in it. So certainly that's going to meet the criteria. But then we have to look at the other criteria. Why are we replacing the roof in this case? Are we replacing it because it's near the end of its useful life, or it's no longer working? And if that's the case, then it would meet that criteria. And so long as that need wasn't because of inadequate repair or maintenance by the landlord, by the owner, then you should meet that criteria. Just to reiterate, when it comes to the eligibility criteria, it's kind of more of a cascading effect of criteria. You start at the very beginning with this criteria project, and you look at whether or not it meets that criteria, eligibility criteria. If it meets the first one, we then move on to the second one, and the third one, and another. So there's multiple points of criteria that need to be met for something to be considered valid. So a question here is about elevator replacement and the increase. Generally speaking, elevators are considered to be a major component of the property. It's needed for people to access their units in many cases, especially people with mobility issues. And truthfully, if you have a building that's more than 4 or 5 stories, you're really going to need an elevator. At least I know I would want one. So again, if replacing an elevator meets the criteria that it is clearly a major component or system, which it does, and we're replacing it because it's near the end of useful life, it likely would meet that criteria for being considered an increase. Going back to our first, or one of our earlier topics, which is email as a method of service. The question is how are email tracking services viewed by the residential tenancy branch? So, I mean, the reason here for this question is proving that something in fact has been served. And in situations where we have something that's being served via email, and you want to be able to prove that it in fact has been received and read, perhaps even clicked on, if there's a link in there. There are services that allow for that read receipt type services, where essentially it provides you with proof that the email has been opened and viewed. So those are valid ways of showing that it has been served, and you may use those. In fact, if you're using email as a method of service specifically for something that's very important, then I would encourage you to use that type of service. Another question around that topic and email as a method of service. Should you, or can you, or are you able to use your own form to prove that email may be used as an acceptable method of service, or must you use the government's form? So to be clear, there is a form provided by the residential tenancy branch that allows landlords and tenants to document that email is going to be used as a method of service. And as that form exists, you certainly can use it, but you're not tied to using that form. You can use your own form if you chose to do so. We at LandlordBC haven't made a specific form of that because there is a very clear and obvious government form, and there's not much that can really be improved on it. It's very clear and to the point. With that being said, we have added it to our agreement, so you can document that on your tenancy agreement at the start of the tenancy. For tenancies that are already in place, again, you'd want to go through and have something filled out. It's also important to note that this form doesn't last forever necessarily. Tenants and landlords, either party, can withdraw their approval to use that email address or email in general as a method of service. So once you get approval to use email as a method of service, once you get that consent can be removed throughout the tenancy. So if partway through someone decides they don't want to receive emails anymore for whatever reason, they can choose to no longer allow that method of service. Very similar to how fax was used, or at least was documented in the previous iteration of the legislation. I doubt it was generally used. So a question here is around the rent increase process, the additional rent increase for capital expenditures, and how long it might take for a hearing on these. We know that right now the residential tenancy branch is very clearly backlogged with hearings, and that is causing a problem for landlords and tenants, really, when it comes to getting timely and straightforward and easy access to decisions, to justice. For these types of processes, the additional rent increase process, which is in fact a dispute resolution process, the residential tenancy branch has set aside a specific number of kind of specialized arbitrators to take on this portfolio, especially during these early days. This is allowing them to become very familiar with the process, critique the process as well to make sure that it's a process that is working as we are as well. Because though they have this kind of team of more dedicated arbitrators, they are able to get to these hearings in a somewhat reasonable time frame. They're obviously not wanting to affect other hearings too much and really put too much delay on those, but it should generally be within a couple months of making the application that you have a hearing. Obviously, we have applied significant pressure to the housing minister and the residential tenancy branch to resolve the issue around hearing wait times. It's something that we know is a problem. They know is a problem as well. And simply put, what needs to happen is they need to hire additional arbitrators. If you do have a situation where your hearing is there's a significant wait for your hearing, the residential tenancy branch does have a process by which you can submit a complaint to the residential tenancy branch or to the ombudsperson, which I recommend that if you are in that type of situation, that you do in fact make that complaint. It's important to have our voices heard on issues such as this. So a question about the additional rent increase process, and the question is, on average, what is the outcome of the additional rent increase applications in terms of, are they in favor of landlords? And what have been the lessons learned for landlords who have applied? Well, from our information, we've only had a couple applications come through. And that's something that we haven't had a chance, because they've only just a couple applications have come through, to really see whether or not there's a trend in this, what the average is going to be. This is something that, quite honestly, is likely going to be a continuing process over the next several years. As we see decisions come through, we will continue to work with the government to ensure the process is is as transparent and working as clearly and smoothly as possible. So we're going to take just a short break for just a few moments here while we get set up for our next session, which is going to be on the importance of air quality. In that session, we're going to welcome Michael Lurangi from the Home Depot and Mark Doucette, again, to talk about the importance of air quality. So we'll just take a quick break while we get that set up. Thank you all for your questions and for your attention.
Can you hear me, Mark?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect.
Perfect. Welcome, Mark and Michael.
Hey, guys.
Perfect. So we are now live for that. So if you want to go ahead